Inside this building, specialists confront the brain's most relentless disorders, restoring movement, quieting severe pain, and helping patients reclaim what illness has taken. Their mission is to repair what's been disrupted and return function where it's been lost. Led by Dr. Teja Sankar, this team pushes the boundaries of functional neurosurgery.
I'm of course a neurosurgeon and also a scientist, and my interest was always in the brain, and that's why of course I became a neurosurgeon. But I'm one of those that from the beginning knew that I wanted to be a clinician scientist. I wanted to look after patients and then also leverage my access to those patients and being led into their worlds in order to better treat illness and study illness. So that was kind of the genesis of it, and I went into this area of neurosurgery called functional neurosurgery. Not that neurosurgeons are necessarily dysfunctional, but functional neurosurgery means instead of cutting things out of the brain that are abnormal, like tumors and so on, it's actually changing the function of the brain, right, to treat illness. So some of the things I do, for example, are deep brain stimulation. That involves putting wires into the brain and delivering electrical stimulation to the brain to treat, in particular, Parkinson's disease.
The brain is probably the most complicated piece of machinery, if you will, that man knows about, with billions of neurons, and to be able to stimulate a portion of that brain with a field of pulsed energy, and to know what it's going to do, or to have any idea what it's going to do, is to me amazing. My controller, which consists of a phone and a communicator. The communicator connects to my IPG, which is the internal pulse generator, implanted in my chest. It's very, very much like a heart stimulator or a pacemaker. And that, as wires is connected, it goes up around my neck, all the way up into these holes that were drilled in my brain, in my skull, into the brain. And then these probes that go down into the substantia nigra. It's been very successful. It's given me back, basically I can sleep at night because of it. I couldn't sleep before, and that was a big problem. I can walk better. My gait is much better. So I mean, those two things there are super important, and it took away my dyskinesia, which is the movements that you see. So those three things are the main things that it did for me, and that's very important.
Other things involve restoring the function of the brain in patients who have chronic pain, particularly chronic facial pain, and there's a disease that I treat called trigeminal neuralgia, which has become a real passion of mine in studying more recently. So trigeminal neuralgia is one of the worst pains known to mankind. It's a horrible facial pain condition where people say that they're being stabbed or shocked in parts of the face. It's typically on one side, and it's in a distribution of a nerve we call the trigeminal nerve. Most often it affects the cheek and the jaw. And these pain attacks, while short-lived, they can be triggered by the simplest things: brushing teeth, touching the face, a cold wind, and patients live in fear of these horrific pain attacks. And in fact, the disease used to be called the suicide disease in our field of neurosurgery, because there were no effective medications and treatments, and early in the 20th century there was a high rate of suicide because of how horrible this pain was. So many of us in neurosurgery treat trigeminal neuralgia. It has a few different causes, and what we're really interested in is in figuring out why people get trigeminal neuralgia, and then how can we improve the treatment, both medical and surgical.
The dentist chair is big because they are very nervous to use any anesthetic, because you're talking about nerves, right, interfering with the nerves, and that can easily trigger a flare-up. Most of the time I would have all my procedures without anesthetic. I know people look at me, just the alternative of having a flare-up, you have to imagine, was worse than sitting there for 2 hours in a dental chair. with the pain. And I only ever had my first proper cleaning in 20 years, just last month. So yeah, it's a world of difference. One of the young interns that came around after surgery and was checking on me in the hospital, he said, "You're really going to feel a difference." And he said, as he left the room, one of his last comments to me was, "Can I see your smile?" Because that's actually a test to them to see if I can control my facial muscles, right? I said, "Oh, you can see it because you just gave it back to me." For years, I couldn't even smile comfortably because if I was in a flare-up, it overtook all my control of my facial muscles too, right?
I think there are a couple of milestones. So the first milestone was getting some support from the University Hospital Foundation and some local startup funds. And I say that because I think as junior researchers, this is really, really important. If you can get that initial push, it helps you grow the vision for what you want to do. So when I first came here, I wasn't quite certain what I was going to study, and then there was this infusion of funding and support, and that allowed me to really hire my first graduate student, and together we did some, I think, really impressive work I'm quite proud of. Particularly credit goes to him in the area of trigeminal neuralgia and facial pain. We really developed some new methods to image the brain in patients with this disorder, and we started a study that continues to this day, where we follow these patients before and after their surgical journey, and we try to understand the disease. Another milestone was, again in that same space of trigeminal neuralgia, getting our first CIHR grant. And that, again, the common theme here is funding, but funding is what you need in order to really grow the team. And that allowed us to, I think, become one of the leading labs in that area, certainly nationally, and if not internationally as well. So those were two milestones. I think another milestone in the Parkinson space, which is the other area that we spend a lot of time looking at, was developing a collaboration with some of my colleagues in neurophysiology. And in particular, there's a gentleman, Dick Stein, who's now sadly departed, who is a real luminary in neurophysiology. And he was interested in studying essentially how the spinal reflexes work and how people move, and in particular, how that's affected in Parkinson's disease. Well, by happenstance, I managed to collaborate with him. And as it turned out, we were able to develop a whole area of research, which we continue till today. And I still look at spinal reflexes, muscle function in patients with Parkinson's disease who are undergoing surgical treatment or who are being treated with medication. I didn't come from a neurophysiology background, but that's a perfect example of how meeting the right people suddenly takes you down this path. And I think if there's some credit that I can take there is sort of saying, well, this is a great opportunity, and let's go with it. Instead of being married to your specific methods and vision, there's a whole big world out there that you can collaborate with. So I would say those are major milestones. The focus of our work is really to understand the diseases that I treat in functional neurosurgery, specifically through the lens of how people respond to surgery. So in things like brain tumors, somebody cuts them out and you can look at a picture after surgery and you can say, were you successful in cutting out the brain tumor? But when you deal with diseases like Parkinson's disease or chronic pain, well, what you're looking at is a functional outcome. So you're not looking at necessarily, well, it's now cured or it's not. You're trying to improve life for people. And what you want to know is why some people, when you do a good operation, they respond really well, and yet others, you do the operation just as well, you think, and yet somehow their response isn't quite as good. And I think that's really our focus, is to use the tools of neuroscience, in particular imaging and physiology, to try to understand why there's this diversity of responses. If we can figure that out, we can better select people for surgery. We don't have to put certain people who we know won't respond through painful procedures. On the other hand, we could open up surgery to people who might be reluctant because we can predict that they might do well. And then we'll also develop a better fundamental understanding of these diseases. And in particular, we might develop what are called biomarkers, which is essentially knowing whether someone has a disease or not, or where along the disease they are in the trajectory of those diseases, and then whether they're responding to treatment or not. And these are all useful questions that come out of our work. we straddle the boundary between discovery of basic science and clinical research. Of course, we're interested in bringing things to the patient, but the patients help us understand the disease. And I collaborate extensively with people, as we mentioned, in neurophysiology, neuroimaging, and in fact, we've even started looking at things at the molecular and protein level as well. As an example, in some of our patients with trigeminal neuralgia with facial pain, as I do surgery on them, I have the unique opportunity to collect spinal fluid, cerebrospinal fluid from them, which is normally just discarded at the time of surgery. But it gives us this unique look at the microenvironment of the brain and the various proteins and inflammatory markers that are there. And in collaboration with some of our colleagues in the Department of Anesthesia and Pain Medicine, we've actually looked at the inflammatory profile of these patients. And what's very interesting is that inflammation is ramped up throughout the nervous system in some of these patients. Now that could be a consequence of pain, but it could also represent something related to the disease. And now we're better characterizing the cerebrospinal fluid in these patients. That might lead us down some more fundamental discoveries in the disease. So again, our motto is any method is available to us if we collaborate with the right people and we ask the right questions. So we're not going to be constrained by one thing. We have many active collaborations. I think within the U of A, our major collaboration is with our colleagues in radiology and imaging science, and those are in particular at the Peter Allen MRI Center. So they develop MRI protocols to better image the brain and the nerves, which are important to us in our work. We work with people in physiology as well, so they provide us insight into doing our experiments related to spinal reflexes, motor control, muscle function in patients with Parkinson's disease. We have collaboration on the clinical side with our colleagues who do gamma knife surgery. This is radiation surgery, very precise radiation. And we have a clinical trial in trigeminal neuralgia in collaboration with those folks, some of whom are my neurosurgery clinical colleagues, but also colleagues in radiation oncology. And then outside of the U of A, we have some collaborations, and one notable one with the University of Michigan, where again, we're studying facial pain and looking at things related to imaging. They have a very large data set, and so do we, and so we've been able to combine those things. It's going to be a couple of years. We're in the infancy of that trial, but it's a very novel trial. So what we are doing is, I've talked quite a bit about trigeminal neuralgia. These patients often suffer for many years with pain, medicines stop being effective, and then they come to me for surgery. And one of those surgical options is gamma knife, this radiation approach. But the hypothesis here is, what if as soon as you're diagnosed with a disease, you get treated with gamma knife? Could that somehow cure you at a very early stage instead of waiting for that treatment to be done many years after you've been taking medication and started to fail? So this is ultra early surgical treatment.
I definitely wish I had surgical treatment of some kind earlier. There's no question, because even though I was on medication, there were some really rough years.
The great advantage of gamma knife is that it's completely non-invasive. So in many ways, it's better than medication. There are no real side effects to it, very minimal anyway, and certainly no opening of the skull and things like that. It's going to take some time, though, to see the results, because patients who are just diagnosed, the real proof will be in the pudding 2 and 5 years down the road to see if they are still pain-free. And then we'll know that we've changed the way to manage this disease.
And alongside the trigeminal neuralgia trial, Dr. Sankar's Parkinson's research is now preparing for clinical trials of its own, a step patients have been waiting for.
The research that Dr. Sankar is working on will eventually allow the feedback to control the device. So there'll be an extra probe that in the brain that will be measuring certain parameters, that when the other parameters are changed, we'll be able to tell the IPG how well it's working. So it'll be self-adjusting. So I'm looking forward to that.
For Dr. Sankar, it's the realization of a lifelong pursuit to restore what disease has taken. For patients, this isn't just science, it's hope.